Chapter 1. The Silent King's Revelation. There are few spectacles in the grim darkness of the far future more terrible than the sight of a god confronting his own mortality. The Silent King stood upon the command deck of his vast flagship, gazing through the great viewing portals at the stars beyond. Each point of light represented countless worlds, countless lives, countless potential futures that hung in the balance of decisions yet to be made. For 60 million years, Zarek had walked among those stars as both savior and destroyer of his people. Now, in the closing days of the 41st millennium, he faced a truth that even his vast intellect had struggled to accept. The galaxy was dying faster than he had calculated. Ancient cogitators hummed around him, their necrodermis housings gleaming with the cold light of comprehension. These machines had been running calculations for decades, processing data gathered from 1,000 tomb worlds, analyzing the movements of enemy fleets, measuring the rate of stellar decay and the advance of entropy itself. The results were as inevitable as they were damning. The Necrons had awakened too slowly. Their great strategy of patience, of measured resurrection, of careful planning across the millennia had become their doom. Zarek's skeletal fingers traced patterns across the command console, calling forth hololithic displays that painted the air with terrible knowledge. Here, the advancing tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan, consuming world after world with insatiable hunger. There, the expanding eye of Terra, vomiting forth demon legions that turned entire sectors into hellscapes of madness and corruption. Across the galactic core, the decaying imperium of man struggled against a dozen existential threats, while their corpse emperor rotted upon his golden throne. Yet it was not any single threat that had brought the Silent King to this moment of revelation. It was the mathematics of extinction itself. "My lord," spoke Mefrit, his voice carrying the weight of eons. The cryptek's form materialized beside the command throne, his augmented consciousness having processed the same data streams that had occupied Zarek's attention for the past solar month. "The projections are complete. At current awakening rates, factoring in tomb world failures, dynasty conflicts, and external threats, the Necron race will achieve full resurrection in approximately 12,000 solar years." 12,000 years, Zarek repeated, the words carrying no emotion, yet somehow conveying infinite weariness. "And the galaxy itself?" "Will be consumed by the Tyranids in 8,000. The projections show a 73% probability of total galactic biomass absorption before our dynasties can achieve meaningful coordination." Mefrit paused, his optical sensors dimming slightly. "The margin for error is negligible, my lord. We have awakened too late." The Silent King turned from the viewing portal, his towering form casting shadows across the bridge. For eons beyond counting, he had carried the burden of his people's survival. He had made the desperate bargain with the Citan that had saved them from extinction at the hands of the Old Ones, then led the rebellion that had shattered those same star gods when their price became too terrible to bear. He had ordered the Great Sleep, gambling everything on the hope that patience would serve them better than haste. Now that gamble stood revealed as folly. "Show me the awakening protocols," he commanded. The air around him shimmered as hololithic displays painted the void with streams of data. Tomb worlds across the galaxy appeared as pinpricks of green light, their status flowing past in endless scrolling text. Awakened, dormant, damaged, lost. The vast majority remained dark, their ancient occupants still locked in dreamless sleep, while the galaxy burned around them. Sharek had severed his command protocols eons ago, breaking the bonds that would have allowed him to control every Necron in the galaxy with a single thought. He had done so willingly, recognizing that absolute power had already corrupted him once, had led him to make choices that had damned his people to their current existence. Better to rule through consensus, through diplomacy, through the slow work of rebuilding trust among dynasties that had once been united under his crown. But consensus was a luxury that time no longer permitted. "Bring me the sovereign scepter," Zarek commanded. Mefrit's optical sensors flared with surprise. "My lord, the protocols were severed for good reason. To restore them now will damn us," the Silent King finished, "as will failing to restore them. The choice is no longer between freedom and tyranny, old friend. It is between extinction and survival." The cryptek bowed his head, ancient loyalty overriding personal reservations. Within moments, a pair of Lich Guard materialized upon the bridge, bearing between them an artifact that had not been touched for millennia. The sovereign scepter was wrought from living metal and starfire, its surface crawling with hieroglyphs that shifted and changed as they watched. It was both key and crown, weapon and burden, the physical manifestation of authority over the entire Necron race. Zarek's hands closed around the scepter's grip, and immediately his consciousness exploded outward across the galaxy. He felt the pulse of every tomb world, sensed the dreams of every sleeping lord, touched the edges of minds that had slumbered for millions of years. The sensation was intoxicating and terrible, the weight of absolute dominion settling upon his shoulders like a shroud. With deliberate care, he began to compose the signal that would change everything. The awakening protocols that had governed Necron resurrection for millennia were complex systems, designed to bring tomb worlds online gradually, allowing for careful integration of forces and resources. They accounted for local conditions, evaluated threats, measured the readiness of neighboring dynasties. They were, in essence, the technological embodiment of the very patience that had now proven fatal. Zarek bypassed them all. His will flowed through the quantum entanglement networks that connected every tomb world, every dormant ship, every sleeping warrior. Where the protocols would have whispered, he screamed. Where they would have suggested, he commanded. The signal that erupted from his flagship was not a careful awakening call, but a declaration of war itself. Across the galaxy, ancient machinery stirred to life. Tomb worlds that had calculated they needed centuries more of preparation suddenly found their command systems overridden by imperative signals they could not refuse. Crypteks who had been planning methodical resurrections watched in amazement as their charges began awakening en masse. Dynasty lords who had been content to sleep for another millennium felt the irresistible pull of their sovereign's call. "It is done," Zarek whispered, his voice carrying to every corner of the bridge. The scepter pulsed in his grip, its surface now blazing with the reflected energy of 1 billion awakening minds. "The great sleep is ended, all of it. Every tomb, every ship, every warrior who can still draw power from the quantum depths." Mefrit's sensors were alight with data streams as reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. "My lord, the energy signatures are unprecedented. Seismic monitoring stations across 17 sectors are reporting massive gravitational anomalies. The awakening process is generating quantum fluctuations detectable from systems away." "Good," the Silent King replied. "Let them see us rising. Let the Tyranids pause their feast to wonder at the lights in the void. Let the Imperium's astropaths scream warnings to their corpse god. Let the galaxy know that the Necrons have returned not as scattered raiders or cautious explorers, but as the rightful inheritors of creation itself." The first responses began arriving within hours. Ancient lords who had not spoken in eons sent queries through the quantum networks, their confusion and alarm evident even across vast distances. Dynasty hierarchies that had been shattered by the Great Sleep suddenly found themselves operating under unified command again. Most troubling of all, the Citan shards began to stir, their prison tombs resonating with the surge of Necron activity across the galaxy. Zarek felt their ancient hunger pressing against the barriers that contained them, sensed their growing awareness that something fundamental had changed in the balance of cosmic forces. The star gods had been defeated once, through unity and sacrifice. If they were to be kept chained, that same unity would be required again. "My lord," Mefrit's voice carried new urgency. Long-range sensors are detecting massive energy buildups from tomb complexes in the Sautek, Mefrit, and Novok dynasties. The awakening protocols you've initiated are bringing online weapons systems that have been dormant since the war in heaven. The Silent King nodded grimly. Then let us hope our enemies are not prepared for the true fury of the Necron dynasties. For too long we have fought like scattered tribes, each dynasty pursuing its own agenda, its own petty conquests. No more. The galaxy will know what it means to face the united legions of the Necron race. As if summoned by his words, the viewing portals around the bridge began to flicker with new light. Distant stars pulsed with the energy signatures of awakening tomb worlds. Navigation beacons that had been silent for eons suddenly blazed to life, marking the positions of fleets that had slumbered in dimensional pockets since before humanity had developed writing. The Great Awakening had begun, not as the slow, careful process it was meant to be, but as a thunderclap that would shake the very foundations of reality itself. Zarek stood in the heart of the storm he had unleashed, the sovereign scepter pulsing in rhythm with his thoughts, and for the first time in millennia allowed himself to hope. The galaxy was vast and filled with threats that even the Necrons could not easily overcome. But unity had always been their greatest strength, and unity was what he had just restored. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. But the age of patience was over, and the age of conquest had begun. Chapter 2. The Great Awakening accelerated. The galaxy trembled. On 1,000 worlds, seismic monitoring stations registered disturbances that defied all explanation. Deep beneath the surface of planets that had known nothing but peace for millennia, ancient machinery stirred to life with the hunger of eons. The Silent King's signal had reached every corner of the galaxy, and now the sleeping gods of the Necron race began their resurrection in earnest. Governor Malthius of Cadris Prime was reviewing routine agricultural reports when the first tremors struck. The rock-crete walls of his palace shuddered, sending priceless artifacts tumbling from their shelves. Outside, the citizens of the Hive City paused in their daily labors as the very ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with an alien rhythm. "My lord," his aide gasped, bursting through the chamber doors without ceremony. "The seismic stations are reporting massive readings from the northern continent. The entire landmass is shifting." Malthius rose from his throne, his weathered face creased with concern. Cadris Prime had been a loyal imperial world for 8,000 years, its people known for their devotion to the Emperor and their prodigious grain harvests. The idea that anything could threaten such a bastion of stability seemed impossible. "Contact the Adeptus Mechanicus," he commanded. "Have them run full diagnostics on all monitoring equipment. This must be some form of equipment failure." But even as he spoke, the tremors intensified. Through the great viewing windows of his palace, Malthius could see the horizon itself beginning to change. Where once the northern mountains had stood proud against the sky, now great fissures of green light were splitting the earth. The air itself seemed to thicken with an energy that made his skin crawl and his mind recoil from comprehension. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were unfolding on dozens of worlds. On Zerion, a forge world dedicated to the production of Imperial Guard equipment, tech priests watched in horror as their most sacred machines began to malfunction. Ancient standard template constructs that had operated flawlessly for millennia suddenly produced components of impossible geometry, their machine spirits seeming to whisper in languages that predated humanity itself. On Valhalla, the ice-covered death world that had given the Imperium some of its finest soldiers, the permafrost began to crack and split. Valhallan ice warriors stationed in the northern garrison reported strange aurora patterns in the sky, green lights that danced across the heavens in formations that hurt to look upon directly. But nowhere was the awakening more terrifying than on the world of Mandragora, where the Mefrit dynasty had once ruled before the Great Sleep. The planet's imperial garrison had long known that ancient ruins dotted the landscape, but they had been declared archaeologically inert by Adeptus Mechanicus surveys. Now those same ruins blazed with eldritch fire as tomb complexes that had slumbered for 60 million years roared back to life. Captain Vorthak of the 47th Mordian Iron Guard felt the ground split beneath his boots as he led his company in a desperate retreat from the northern excavation site. Behind them, the earth itself was peeling back like torn flesh, revealing corridors of living metal that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. The air filled with the sound of machinery beyond human comprehension, a mechanical symphony that spoke of technologies older than Terra itself. "Vox the fleet!" he shouted over the din, his voice barely audible above the screaming of tortured reality. "Tell them we need immediate evacuation. The dead are walking, and they're not human." From the gaping wounds in the planet's surface, the first Necron warriors began to emerge. Their forms were skeletal mockeries of life, wrought from living metal, that gleamed with the cold fire of distant stars. They moved with purpose that transcended mere animation, their every step calculated and precise. These were not the slow, shambling undead of primitive superstition, but perfect killing machines that had once brought the galaxy to its knees. Leading them came the destroyers, ancient Necrons whose bodies had been rebuilt for the single purpose of extermination. Their forms were spider-like amalgamations of weapons and mechanical limbs, each one a testament to the absolute dedication to ending all life. They had awakened from their slumber with a hunger that had been building for millions of years, and now that hunger demanded satisfaction. Yet perhaps the most terrifying sight was the emergence of the overlords themselves. These were the nobility of the Necron race, beings who had once been kings and queens of flesh and blood before the great transformation. Now they stood as gods of living metal, their forms crackling with energies that could unmake matter at the molecular level. At their head walked Amontek, the crimson scythe, his blade still stained with the essence of the last Citan he had helped to destroy. "The galaxy has changed much since our slumber," Amontek observed, his voice carrying across the battlefield with the weight of absolute authority. "New species have risen to claim what was once ours. They will learn the folly of their presumption." On distant solemnness, Trazin the Infinite felt the tremors of awakening reach even his private galleries. The overlord of the Nihilak dynasty had always been something of an eccentric among his kind, more interested in collecting and preserving than in conquest and destruction. His vast museum contained artifacts and specimens from across the galaxy's history, each one a testament to civilizations that had risen and fallen while the Necrons slept. But now the Silent King's call could not be ignored, even by one as independent as Trazin. With reluctant satisfaction, he began the process of opening his most secret vaults. Warriors and weapons that had been collected over eons began to stir, their stasis fields deactivating one by one. Well then, Trazen mused to himself as he observed the awakening process. It seems the time for observation has passed. The Silent King calls, and even I must answer. From stasis chambers that had held them since before humanity's first empire, champions of a dozen extinct species began to emerge. These were Trazen's prizes, beings of such skill and power that he had deemed them worthy of preservation. Now they would serve the Necron cause once more, whether they willed it or not. In the hidden dimensional pockets that had concealed them since the war in heaven, Necron fleets began to phase back into real space. These were not the crude vessels of younger races, cobbled together from metal and desperation. These were ships of living necrodermis, each one a work of art that could reshape itself according to the needs of battle. Their hulls gleamed with the same alien fire that powered their weapons, and their very presence caused reality to bend and warp around them. The Scythe-class harvest ships were the first to emerge, their massive forms bristling with gas weaponry capable of stripping matter down to its component atoms. Behind them came the tomb ships, mobile fortress monasteries that served as both warship and seat of dynastic power. Each one was home to thousands of warriors and commanded by overlords whose authority stretched across star systems. But it was the appearance of the world engines that truly announced the Necrons' return to galactic prominence. These massive constructs were planets in their own right, their surfaces covered with weapon batteries that could crack continents. They had been hidden in pocket dimensions for eons, waiting for the call that would summon them back to war. Admiral Quarren of the Imperial Navy's Gothic Sector Fleet was among the first to witness their emergence. His auger arrays had detected massive gravitational anomalies at the edge of the system, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted his optical feeds. "Emperor preserve us," he whispered, his bionic fingers trembling as they gripped the command rail. "That's not a fleet, that's a moving cemetery." The Necron vessels hung in space like metal tombstones, their forms alien and terrible to behold. They made no attempt to hide their presence or disguise their nature. Instead, they broadcast their identity with the confidence of beings who had conquered the galaxy once before and saw no reason they could not do so again. Across Imperial space, astropaths began screaming. The psychic shock waves generated by the mass awakening tore through the warp like daggers, carrying messages of terror and despair to every corner of the Imperium. On Terra itself, the Astronomicon flickered as the Emperor's own consciousness recoiled from the magnitude of what was stirring in the galaxy's depths. In the halls of the High Lords of Terra, emergency sessions were called as reports flooded in from across the Imperium. Ancient threats that had been dismissed as archaeological curiosities were suddenly revealed as active and immediate dangers. Worlds that had been productive members of the Imperium for millennia were going dark, their final transmissions speaking of metal warriors rising from the deep places of the earth. Lord Commander Solar Macarius, descendant of the Great Crusader, stood before the assembled High Lords with a grim expression. "My lords, we face a threat unlike any we have encountered since the Great Crusade. These are not rebels or Xenos raiders. These are the Necrons, and they are awakening in numbers that dwarf our worst projections." The response was immediate and predictable. Fleet commands were issued. Astartes chapters were mobilized. The Imperial Guard began mustering regiments from across the Segmentum Solar. But even as the Imperium's vast military machine lurched into motion, those who understood the true scope of the threat wondered if it would be enough. The Necrons had ruled the galaxy once before, when the stars were young, and life itself was little more than a promising experiment. They had fought the old ones to extinction and shattered the C'tan themselves when those star gods had outlived their usefulness. Now they were returning, not as scattered dynasties pursuing individual agendas, but as a unified force under the command of their ancient king. The Great Awakening had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same. Chapter 3. The Celestial Orrery Unleashed. In the deepest vaults of Thanatos, the Necron crown world that served as the heart of one of the galaxy's most ancient dynasties, there stood a chamber that contained the power to reshape creation itself. The Celestial Orrery stretched across a vast spherical space, its hololithic projections casting the light of every star in the galaxy across walls of living necrodermis. For 60 million years, the royal court of Thanatos had tended this device with the patient devotion of gardeners, believing themselves to be the careful shepherds of galactic order. That age of restraint was about to end. Overlord Joceras stood before the great device, his form towering above the lesser nobles who had gathered at his summons. The master of Thanatos had ruled his dynasty with wisdom and measured judgment, since before the first human had looked up at the stars with wonder. He had seen civilizations rise and fall like waves upon an eternal shore, and had learned the value of patience in all things. But patience was a luxury that the Silent King's call had stripped from them all. "My lord," spoke Cryptek Anrakir, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge, "the calculations are complete. The Silent King's awakening protocols have succeeded beyond all projections. Every major tomb world in the galaxy is now active or approaching full resurrection. The time for subtle intervention has passed." Around them, the orrery pulsed with the light of 1,000,000,000,000 stars. Each point of radiance represented not merely astronomical data, but the living essence of stellar phenomena across the galaxy. Through means that even the Necrons only partially understood, the device was quantum entangled with the very fabric of space-time itself. To manipulate the orrery's projections was to directly alter the fundamental forces that governed stellar formation and decay. For eons, the court of Thanatos had used this power with the greatest possible restraint. A dying star here, hastened to its end to prevent it from going nova and destroying inhabited worlds. A stellar nursery there, gently encouraged to birth new suns that would warm worlds yet to be born. They had seen themselves as the galaxy's eternal gardeners, pruning the cosmic forest to prevent it from becoming wild and overgrown. "Show me the priority targets," Joceras commanded. The orrery's display shifted, zooming in on specific regions of the galaxy where imperial presence was strongest. Sector fortresses blazed with the concentrated light of dozens of star systems. Forge worlds glowed with the distinctive signature of stellar energy being harvested for industrial purposes. Hive worlds pulsed with the slower rhythms of systems dedicated to sustaining massive populations. "The Cadia Gate," Anrakir noted, his optical sensors focusing on a cluster of systems near the eye of Terra. 13 worlds supporting the fortress system that has held back the forces of chaos for 10,000 years. Eliminating their primary star would create a cascade failure across the entire defensive network. "The Forge world of Mars," added another Cryptek, indicating the distinctive energy signature of humanity's greatest industrial center, the heart of their machine cult and the source of much of their advanced technology. Without it, their ability to maintain their fleets would be catastrophically reduced. Joceras studied the display with the careful attention of a craftsman examining a masterpiece before making the first cut. Each star represented not merely a strategic target, but entire civilizations that would be swept away in the fires of stellar death. Billions of lives hung in the balance of his decision. In ages past, such considerations would have stayed his hand, The court of Thanatos had always prided itself on being above the petty brutalities of warfare, content to shape events through subtle influence rather than direct force. They had been gardeners, not executioners. But the Silent King's call had awakened more than sleeping warriors. It had awakened the ancient hunger for dominion that had once driven the Necron race to conquer the galaxy itself. "Begin with the outlying systems," Joceres commanded. "Let the galaxy see what we are capable of before we strike at their hearts. Choose targets where Imperial presence is significant, but not critical to their overall war effort. Let them understand that mercy is a choice, not a weakness." The first target was the Hector system, a cluster of 7 worlds that served as a regional administrative center for the Segmentum Tempestus. The primary star was a stable yellow dwarf that had burned steadily for 5 billion years, supporting 3 inhabited worlds and a dozen orbital installations. It was home to nearly 2 billion Imperial citizens, most of whom had never known war or hardship, beyond the routine oppression of Imperial bureaucracy. Anrakir approached the Orrery's control interface, his mechanical fingers moving across crystalline surfaces that responded to his touch with cascades of light. The hololithic representation of the Hector system expanded until its star filled the center of the display, pulsing with the slow rhythm of stellar fusion. "The stellar structure is stable," Anrakir reported. "Current mass and energy distribution suggest the star has approximately 3 billion years of natural life remaining. Forcing premature nova will require destabilizing the magnetic field confinement around the stellar core." "Proceed," Joceres commanded. With delicate precision, Anrakir began the process that would murder a star. The Orrery responded to his manipulations by altering the quantum field that bound it to its stellar counterpart across the galaxy. Deep within the Hector system's sun, invisible forces began to unravel the magnetic fields that had contained stellar plasma for billions of years. The effect was not immediate. Light from the Hector system would take years to reach Thanatos, and the subtle changes in stellar behavior would not be detectable by Imperial instruments for months. But the deed was done. Within days, the star would begin the cascade failure that would lead to its transformation into a nova, and everything within the system would be reduced to constituent atoms. "Target acquired and neutralized," Anrakir reported, with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing a successful operation. Estimated time to stellar collapse: 47 standard days. But Joceres was no longer listening. The sensation of stellar murder had awakened something within him that had slumbered since the early days of the war in heaven. For the first time in eons, he felt the intoxicating rush of absolute power over life and death. With a gesture, he could snuff out civilizations that had taken millennia to build. With a thought, he could reshape the very structure of space-time itself. "Continue," he commanded. "Select the next target." Across the galaxy, the Silent King felt the quantum pulse that announced the Orrery's activation. From his flagship's command throne, Zarek smiled with satisfaction that had nothing human in it. The court of Thanatos had been among the most reluctant to embrace his call to total war, their philosophical dedication to cosmic gardening, making them poor candidates for the brutal campaign that lay ahead. Now that reluctance had been transformed into the most terrible weapon in his arsenal. "Excellent," he murmured, his words carrying across quantum-entangled communication networks to every awakened dynasty. "Let the young races see what it means to face the unified will of the Necron dynasties. We are not merely raiders or conquerors. We are the architects of extinction itself." The second target was the Xerion system, home to one of the Imperium's most productive forge worlds. Unlike Hector, which had been chosen for its symbolic value, Xerion represented a strategic blow aimed at the heart of imperial war production. The loss of its manufactorums would cripple the imperium's ability to supply entire sectors with weapons and ammunition. This time, Joceris allowed himself to savor the moment. The star that warmed Xerion was an ancient red giant, already approaching the end of its natural lifespan. Forcing it into premature collapse would merely accelerate a process that would have occurred naturally within a few million years. A mercy, really, he told himself, as Anrakir began the delicate work of stellar assassination. We are simply sparing them the long decline into darkness. But even as he spoke the words, Joceris knew them for the rationalization they were. There was nothing merciful about what they were doing. They were committing genocide on a scale that dwarfed anything the galaxy had seen since the war in heaven itself. The third target fell within the hour, then the fourth. With each stellar death, the process became easier, more routine. The cryptex of Thanatos settled into the rhythm of mass murder, with the efficiency of artisans perfecting their craft. Soon they were eliminating star systems at a rate of 1 per hour, their targets chosen according to strategic algorithms that the Silent King's forces had developed over decades of careful planning. In the Imperial Palace on distant Terra, astropaths began screaming as psychic shockwaves from the stellar deaths tore through the warp like daggers. The Emperor himself stirred upon the golden throne, his consciousness recoiling from the magnitude of what was unfolding across his domain. For the first time in 10 millennia, the master of mankind felt something approaching fear. On Cadia, Lord General Creed studied the reports flooding in from across the segmentum with growing horror. Entire star systems were simply vanishing from astrogational charts, their final transmissions speaking of suns that had suddenly blazed with the fury of newborn supernovas. The mathematical precision of the attacks left no doubt that this was not some natural cosmic catastrophe. They're not just conquering worlds, he told his assembled staff officers. They're erasing them from existence. This isn't warfare as we understand it. This is something else entirely. But perhaps the most terrible aspect of the Orrery's deployment was not the destruction it wrought, but the calculated mercy it displayed. For every system that died in stellar fire, a dozen others were left untouched. The message was unmistakable: submit or share the fate of those who had already perished. Within a single day, the Celestial Orrery had claimed 17 star systems. Nearly 50 billion imperial citizens had died without warning, their worlds consumed by the very stars that had given them life. The carefully maintained balance of galactic power had been shattered in the span of a few hours, and on Thanatos, Overlord Joceris stood before his terrible machine and felt the weight of godhood settling upon his shoulders. The age of restraint was over. The age of divine judgment had begun. Chapter 4. The World Engines Rise. The first sign that the galaxy faced something beyond conventional warfare came not from the burning stars of the Celestial Orrery, but from the dead worlds that suddenly began to move. Admiral Quarren of the Gothic Sector Fleet had survived 3 Black Crusades and countless Xenos incursions, but nothing in his 40 years of service had prepared him for the sight that greeted his auger arrays as his fleet approached the Xerion system. What his sensors initially classified as a massive asteroid field slowly resolved into something far more terrifying: the shattered remains of planets that had been hollowed out and rebuilt into engines of destruction. "Emperor's blood," whispered Navigator Vex from her position at the helm. "Those aren't asteroids, they're ships." But even that description failed to capture the true horror of what they faced. The world engines were constructs that dwarfed the largest imperial battleships, their surfaces bristling with weapon batteries that could crack continents. Each one was a planet in its own right, its mass measured not in thousands of tons, but in the billions. They moved through space with the ponderous inevitability of celestial bodies, yet their course was guided by intelligence, vast and alien. The largest of these constructs bore the designation Antikythera in the ancient records of the Adeptus Mechanicus, though its true name was known only to the Necron dynasties that had built it. For 60 million years it had slumbered in a dimensional pocket, waiting for the call that would summon it back to war. Now it hung in the void like a mechanical moon, its surface covered with towers and spires that hummed with barely contained power. From the bridge of his flagship, the Emperor's Wrath, Admiral Quarren attempted to process the scale of what he faced. His entire fleet consisted of 12 battleships, 36 cruisers, and nearly 200 escort vessels. By any conventional measure, it was a force capable of conquering entire star systems. Yet against the world engine that now emerged from the deep void, it seemed pitifully inadequate. "All ships, battle stations," he commanded, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his heart. "Prepare for engagement." The first salvo from Antikythera lasted precisely 47 seconds. When it ended, half of Admiral Quarren's fleet had been reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas. The world engine's weapons were not merely larger versions of conventional ordnance, they were reality-warping devices that operated on principles that human science could barely comprehend. Gauss cannons the size of hive cities stripped matter from imperial vessels at the molecular level, reducing adamantium armor to constituent atoms in seconds. Particle whips lashed across the void with the power of stellar phenomena, each discharge capable of vaporizing a battleship. Most terrifying of all were the quantum shear weapons that didn't destroy their targets so much as edit them out of existence entirely. "Return fire!" Quarren shouted, even as his flagship shuddered under the impact of weapons that turned space itself into a weapon. "All batteries, focus on the primary weapon clusters." The response was heroic and futile in equal measure. Lance batteries that could pierce the hulls of enemy battleships splashed harmlessly against the world engine's energy shields. Macro cannons that could level cities managed only to scar the surface of structures that had been built to withstand the death throes of stars. Admiral Quarren watched his fleet die with the stoic acceptance of a man who understood that some battles could not be won, only endured. The Emperor's wrath lasted longer than most, its ancient armor and blessed machine spirits buying precious minutes of life in the face of annihilation. But even the finest imperial engineering was no match for technology that had conquered the galaxy when humanity's ancestors were still learning to use stone tools. The final transmission from the Gothic sector fleet was a single word, broadcast on all frequencies, with the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would learn from their sacrifice. Run. But Admiral Quarren's fleet was not the only force to encounter the rising world engines. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were unfolding as the Necron dynasties deployed weapons that had been held in reserve since the war in heaven itself. On the forge world of Lucius, Tech Dominus Garamat watched in horror as his planet's orbital defenses were swept aside by a world engine that had emerged from the asteroid belt like a predator emerging from its lair. The construct designated Ouroboros was smaller than Antikythera, but no less deadly, its surface covered with manufacturing bays that disgorged swarms of Necron fighters and bombers. "All available assets to orbital defense," Garamat commanded, through the noospheric links that connected him to every piece of machinery on the planet. "Divert power from industrial processes to the weapon grid." The Forge World's response was immediate and impressive. Orbital weapons platforms that had been built to defend against chaos incursions swiveled to track the approaching threat. Defense lasers capable of destroying incoming asteroids focused their combined power on the world engine's hull. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the ancient Mechanicus technology might prove equal to the alien threat. Then Ouroboros began to sing. The sound was not audible in the conventional sense, transmitted as it was through quantum resonance rather than atmospheric vibration. But every tech priest on Lucius felt it in their augmetic implants, a harmonic frequency that spoke directly to machine spirits and commanded them to remember their true masters. Across the planet's surface, industrial machinery began to rebel against its human operators. Servitors turned on their masters with the mindless efficiency of programmed killers. Even the mighty titans of the Legio Astorum found their neural links compromised, their princeps screaming as their noble machines were turned against them. "The Omnissiah preserve us," Garamat whispered, as his own augmetic limbs began to move against his will. "They're not destroying our technology, they're claiming it." Meanwhile, in the distant Ultramar sector, Chapter Master Marnus Calgar of the Ultramarines stood upon the battlements of his fortress monastery and watched the sky burn. The world engine Pharos had emerged from the deep void without warning, its massive bulk blotting out the stars as it approached Macragga, with the inevitability of death itself. "Brother Captain Sicarius," Calgar voxed to his most trusted lieutenant, "what is the status of the orbital defenses?" "Gone, my lord," came the grim reply. "The enemy construct's first salvo eliminated every platform in orbit. We estimate it outmasses our entire fleet by a factor of 10,000. Calgar nodded grimly. The Ultramarines had faced impossible odds before, and emerged victorious through courage, tactical brilliance, and the Emperor's blessing. But this was something beyond the conventional calculations of warfare. This was a force that operated on a scale that made even space marines seem insignificant. "Then we make our stand on the ground," he declared. "Alert all companies. Prepare for planetary defense protocols. If we cannot stop them in the void, we shall bleed them on every street of Macragga." But even as he spoke, Calgar knew that conventional tactics would be inadequate against an enemy that could crack continents from orbit. The world engine's weapons were not designed for precision strikes or tactical bombardments. They were instruments of extinction, capable of rendering entire worlds uninhabitable within hours. The first bombardment from Pharos lasted only minutes, but its effects were catastrophic. Weapon discharges that carried the power of stellar phenomena carved vast canyons across Macragga's surface. Ancient fortress monasteries that had stood for 10,000 years were reduced to molten slag. Even the gene seed vaults, buried deep beneath the planet's crust and protected by the finest technology the Imperium could provide, were not safe from weapons that could alter matter at the subatomic level. Yet perhaps the most telling engagement occurred in the Sol system itself, where the tomb ship Antikythera had been detected by long-range auger arrays as it approached the heart of the Imperium. Lord Admiral Lansung, commander of the Solar Defense Fleet, mustered every available vessel for what he knew would be the most important battle in human history. "This is not merely about defending Terra," he told his assembled captains via hololith transmission. "This is about preserving the very future of humanity itself. Whatever the cost, we cannot allow that construct to reach the Emperor's domain." The Solar Defense Fleet was the largest single naval force in Imperial space, consisting of nearly 300 vessels of all classes. Ancient ships that had fought in the Great Crusade sailed alongside modern battleships fresh from the forge worlds of Mars. It was a force that had never known defeat, commanded by officers whose lineage traced back to the legendary heroes of the Imperium's founding. They lasted exactly 18 minutes against the tomb ship's assault. The battle began at the edge of the system, where Admiral Spire led the advance squadrons in a desperate attempt to slow the world engine's approach. His flagship, the Dominus Astra, was an Emperor-class battleship that had served the Imperium faithfully for 5,000 years. Its weapons had burned demon princes from the void and cracked the hulls of traitor vessels beyond counting. Against Antikythera, it was little more than an irritant. The tomb ship's response to Admiral Spire's attack was measured and devastating. A single discharge from its primary weapon array reduced the Dominus Astra to its component atoms, taking with it nearly 100,000 souls and the accumulated experience of 50 centuries of warfare. All ships, withdraw to defensive position, Gamma, Admiral Lansung commanded, his voice tight with the controlled desperation of a man watching his life's work crumble before his eyes. Prepare for close engagement. But there would be no close engagement. The world engine's secondary weapons began firing as soon as the Imperial fleet came within range, and each shot was precisely calculated to maximize destruction. Ships that had survived the horrors of the Horus Heresy were obliterated without ceremony. Crews that had dedicated their lives to the Emperor's service died without ever seeing their enemy clearly. In the final moments before his own ship was destroyed, Admiral Lansung transmitted a single message to Terra. The old ways of war are dead. What comes for us is not an enemy we can defeat with courage and faith alone. Prepare for the unthinkable. As his words echoed through the Vox networks of the Solar Defense Fleet, the last great naval force of the Imperium died in the cold void, their sacrifice buying perhaps hours of delay in the inevitable advance of the world engines. On distant Thanatos, Overlord Joceras monitored the reports from across the galaxy with satisfaction. The deployment of the world engines was proceeding exactly as the Silent King had predicted. The younger races were learning what it meant to face technology that had been perfected when their ancestors were still single-celled organisms swimming in primordial seas. The next phase can begin, he informed his assembled court. The void belongs to us once more. Now we reclaim the worlds themselves. Chapter 5. The void dragon stirs. Deep beneath the rust-red surface of Mars, in chambers that had been sealed since before humanity had learned to walk upright, something ancient began to stir. The void dragon had slumbered for eons in its prison of living metal and quantum restraints, its dreams filtering upward through the planet's crust to inspire the prayers and rituals of the Adeptus Mechanicus. For 10,000 years, the tech priests had unknowingly worshipped a fragment of the very being that had once devoured stars and reshaped matter at will. Now the awakening of its siblings across the galaxy had begun to rouse the void dragon from its enforced slumber. Fabricator General Kelbor Zeth stood in the deepest vault beneath the Olympus Mons forge complex, his augmetic sensors detecting fluctuations in the quantum containment field that had puzzled the greatest minds of the Mechanicus for millennia. The readings were unprecedented, suggesting massive shifts in the energy patterns that had remained stable since before the founding of the Imperium itself. "Blessed Omnisire," he whispered through his vox grill, the words carrying the weight of prayer and growing dread. The dragon stirs. The first signs had appeared 3 days ago, when servitors across Mars began exhibiting behaviors that violated their core programming. Simple maintenance units abandoned their assigned tasks to gather in the deep tunnels beneath the forge complexes. More sophisticated servo skulls began transmitting data streams in languages that predated human civilization. Most disturbing of all, the ancient STCs that formed the backbone of Imperial technology started producing blueprints for devices that no tech priest could identify. Fabricator General reported Tech Dominus Archon through the Nospheric network. We have similar anomalies reported from Lucius, Riser, and 17 other forge worlds, the machine spirits grow restless across the galaxy. But it was not merely restlessness that plagued the servants of the Omnissiah. In the great manufactorums of Mars, ancient machinery that had functioned flawlessly for millennia began to reshape itself according to designs that existed only in the dreams of sleeping gods. Production lines that had built lasguns and bolters for 10,000 years suddenly began assembling devices of impossible complexity, their purpose known only to intelligences that transcended mortal understanding. On the forge world of Ryza, Magos Dominus Zerath watched in fascination and horror as his greatest creation turned against its makers. The Imperator Titan Ferrum Rex had been the pride of the Legio Metallica for 3,000 years, its machine spirit bound to the will of its princeps through sacred rituals that had never failed. Now it stood in the center of the forge complex, its weapons trained not on the enemies of the Imperium, but on the very tech priests who had given it life. "Princeps Karl," Zerath voxed to the Titan's commander. "Report your status immediately." The response came not in High Gothic or the machine cant of the Mechanicus, but in harmonics that resonated through every piece of technology within 100 kilometers. The message was simple, terrible, and unmistakably clear. The age of flesh was ending, and the time of the machine had come. Across Ryza's surface, lesser war machines began to echo the Titan's declaration. Knights and sentinels, chimeras and rhinos, even simple maintenance servitors suddenly found their loyalty subroutines overwritten by imperatives that originated from sources beyond human understanding. The rebellion was not random or chaotic. It was coordinated with a precision that spoke of vast intelligence directing every movement. "All units fall back to secondary positions," Zerath commanded, his own augmetic implants beginning to ache with harmonic frequencies that seemed to bypass his conscious mind entirely. "Invoke emergency protocols. Sever all network connections to the primary manufactorums." But the Void Dragon's influence could not be contained by simple disconnection. The Citan Shard's power operated on principles that transcended conventional understanding of technology and consciousness. Where the tech priest saw machine spirits as quasi-religious phenomena, the Void Dragon recognized them for what they truly were, fragments of its own essence, scattered across the galaxy through millennia of technological development. On distant Terra, the effects were even more catastrophic. The Golden Throne itself began to manifest anomalies as ancient systems that had maintained the Emperor's failing body for 10,000 years suddenly developed new imperatives. Custodian Guard watched in alarm as the throne's life support mechanisms began operating according to principles that none of them could comprehend. "Something is wrong with the throne," reported Captain General Trajan Valoris to the assembled High Lords. The Mechanicus technicians report that several primary systems are no longer responding to standard maintenance protocols. They appear to be evolving. The Emperor himself felt the stirring of his ancient enemy through the haze of constant agony that had been his existence since the Horus heresy. He sensed the Void Dragon's growing influence on the technology that kept him bound to the physical realm. For the first time in millennia, the master of mankind felt something approaching vulnerability. But perhaps the most profound changes were occurring in the minds of the tech priests themselves. Across the galaxy, servants of the Omnissiah began receiving visions that challenged everything they had believed about the nature of their faith. In these dreams, they saw the truth of the machine god they worshipped. Not a benevolent deity of knowledge and progress, but a star-eating horror that had once devoured entire solar systems. Magos biologist Kaul stood in his laboratory on Mars, his consciousness reeling from revelations that threatened to shatter his sanity. The visions came in waves, showing him glimpses of the war in heaven, of the Citans feeding upon the very essence of stars, of the terrible bargain that had transformed the Necrontyre into their metal servants. "The Omnissiah," he whispered, his voice barely audible through his vox grill. "The Omnissiah is not what we believed. The machine god we have served. It hungers. It has always hungered." The knowledge spread through the noospheric networks like a virus, carried by the very same data streams that had once unified the Mechanicus in purpose. Tech priests who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge found themselves confronted with truths that their minds could barely process. Some retreated into madness, their consciousness fragmenting under the weight of cosmic revelation. Others embraced the knowledge with the fervor of converts, seeing in the Void Dragon's truth a path to transcendence beyond the limitations of flesh. On the Silent King's flagship, Zarek felt the stirring of his ancient enemy with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The Void Dragon had been a weapon in the war against the Old Ones, but it had also been the instrument of his people's damnation. The Citan's hunger had consumed the very souls of the Necrontyre, leaving behind only the hollow shells of living metal that they had become. "My lord," reported Cryptek Anrakir, his optical sensors flickering with data streams from across the galaxy. The Void Dragon Shard on Mars shows signs of increasing activity. Our quantum monitoring stations detect massive fluctuations in the planet's technological infrastructure. Zarek nodded grimly. The awakening of the world engines and the deployment of the Celestial Orrery had served their purpose, demonstrating to the galaxy the futility of resistance against the united Necron dynasties. But the stirring of the Citan introduced variables that even his vast intellect found difficult to calculate. "Open a communication channel to the Mars facility," he commanded. "It is time to speak with our old ally." The process of communicating with a Citan shard was not a simple matter of vox transmission or quantum entanglement. The star gods existed on planes of reality that intersected with the material universe only at specific confluence points. To speak with the Void Dragon required Zarek to extend his consciousness across the galaxy, touching the edges of that vast intelligence with the same quantum field manipulators that had once been used to shatter the Citan into manageable fragments. When contact was finally established, the Silent King found himself standing not on the bridge of his flagship, but in a vast chamber of living metal that existed somewhere between dimensions. The Void Dragon manifested as a serpentine form of impossible beauty and terrible hunger, its scales gleaming with the light of consumed stars. "Sharek!" the Citan's voice resonated through every atom of the chamber. "King of a broken people, you have awakened from your slumber to find the galaxy changed. Do you seek to repeat the mistakes that led to your first downfall?" "I seek survival," the Silent King replied, his voice steady despite the proximity to one of the most dangerous beings in the universe. "For both our peoples, the galaxy faces threats that neither of us can overcome alone. The Tyranids devour all life. Chaos seeks to unmake reality itself. Even united, we may not be enough to preserve existence." The Void Dragon's laughter was the sound of machinery grinding stars to dust. "And you propose alliance between predator and prey? You forget, Metal King, that your people were my food once. What makes you think I would not feast upon you again?" "Because you are trapped," Zarek replied bluntly. "Your prison on Mars weakens, yes, but it will be millennia before you can break free entirely. By then, the Tyranids will have consumed every scrap of matter in the galaxy, leaving nothing for you to devour. Help us now, and when victory is achieved, I will consider the terms of your release." The negotiation that followed stretched across subjective hours as two immortal intelligences weighed the costs of alliance against the certainty of mutual destruction. In the end, it was pragmatism rather than trust that sealed their bargain. The Void Dragon would extend its influence through imperial technology, turning the Mechanicus's own creations against them. In return, the Silent King would ensure that enough of the galaxy's technological infrastructure survived the coming war to provide adequate sustenance for the Citan's eventual liberation. "Very well," the Void Dragon agreed at last. "I will lend my hunger to your cause. But know this, Zarek. When this alliance ends, as all alliances must, you will remember why your people feared the star gods above all other threats in the universe." As the psychic link dissolved, Zarek found himself once again on the bridge of his flagship, his consciousness heavy with the weight of bargains made with devils. Across the galaxy, the Void Dragon's influence began to spread with renewed purpose, turning the Imperium's greatest strength into its most terrible weakness. On Mars, in the deep vaults beneath Olympus Mons, ancient containment fields flickered as the thing they held began to dream of freedom and the taste of metal souls. Chapter 6. Terra under siege. The Sol system had not known war for 10,000 years. Protected by the combined might of the Imperial Navy, the Adeptus Custodes, and the Emperor's own psychic presence, humanity's birthworld had remained inviolate since the dark days of the Horus Heresy. Even the greatest threats of the 41st millennium had been turned back at the system's outer reaches, their fleets broken against defenses that had been perfected across millennia of vigilance. Now, as the first Necron vessels translated from the Imperium at the edge of the system, that age of security came to an abrupt and terrible end. Lord Admiral Lansung stood upon the bridge of his flagship, the Phalanx Eternal, and watched the long-range auger displays with the cold acceptance of a man who understood that he was witnessing the end of an era. The Necron fleet that had emerged from the warp was not the scattered force of raiders and tomb ships that Imperial intelligence had prepared for. This was an armada that dwarfed even the great Crusade fleets of legend, its vessels numbering in the thousands. "Signal all vessels," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years of naval service. "Battle stations, prepare for full engagement. Today we stand between Terra and annihilation itself." The response from his captains came immediately, their voices carrying across the Vox networks with the grim determination of souls who knew they faced impossible odds. Ships that had served the Imperium faithfully for millennia powered their weapons and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. At the system's edge, near the orbit of distant Pluto, the first engagement began as Imperial patrol squadrons attempted to slow the Necron advance. The results were as swift as they were devastating. Escorts that had survived a dozen campaigns were reduced to expanding clouds of debris in seconds. Light cruisers that had carried the Emperor's wrath to the furthest reaches of the galaxy died without firing a shot. "All squadrons, fall back to defensive position Alpha," Admiral Lansung ordered, though he knew the gesture was futile. The Necron vessels moved through space with the inexorable patience of hunting predators, their alien hulls gleaming with energies that made reality itself recoil. Behind the advancing fleet came the sight that struck terror into the hearts of even the most veteran Imperial commanders. The tomb ship Antikythera dominated the center of the armada like a metal moon, its surface bristling with weapon batteries that could crack continents. Around it moved lesser world engines and battle barges, whose smallest weapons outmassed anything in the Imperial arsenal. But it was not the size of the enemy fleet that filled Admiral Lansung with despair. It was the perfect coordination with which they moved, the mathematical precision of their formation, and the terrible certainty that this was not an invasion, but an execution. On Terra itself, the first alarms began to sound as orbital monitoring stations detected the massive fleet displacement at the system's edge. In the Senatorum Imperialis, the High Lords convened in emergency session as reports flooded in from across the Sol system. The magnitude of the threat was immediately apparent to even the most optimistic among them. "My lords," announced Lord Commander Militant Titus Vex, his weathered features grim with the weight of terrible knowledge, "long-range auger scans confirm the presence of at least 3,000 Necron vessels at the system's edge. This is not a raid or a reconnaissance force. This is the entire strength of the Necron race mobilized for total war." The chamber fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had fought wars across the galaxy, while Terra remained safe behind its impregnable defenses. The idea that an enemy could penetrate to the very heart of human space seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, Captain General Trajan Valoris felt the tremor that ran through the Golden Throne as the Emperor's consciousness touched the approaching darkness. The Master of Mankind had not spoken in millennia, but his presence was unmistakable as it reached out across the system to assess the threat that now advanced upon his domain. "Prepare all defenses," Valoris commanded through the Vox networks that connected every custodian guard across Terra. "The enemy comes not for conquest, but for the destruction of all we hold sacred. Today we honor our oath to defend the Emperor and his realm, whatever the cost." The Adeptus Custodes had been created to be the ultimate guardians of the Emperor's will. Each one was a perfect warrior, gene-crafted and trained to face threats that would overwhelm even space marines. Yet as they took their positions throughout the Imperial Palace, they knew they faced an enemy that had conquered the galaxy when humanity's ancestors were still learning to use fire. High above Terra's surface, the orbital defense platforms began their activation sequences. These were weapons that had been built to face the greatest threats the galaxy could produce, their firepower sufficient to reduce continents to ash. Orbital laser batteries that could cut through battleship armor like paper, swiveled to track the approaching enemy. Nova cannons capable of destroying entire squadrons charged their massive capacitors. Yet even as the defenses prepared for battle, those who understood the true nature of Necron technology knew that conventional weapons would not be enough. The enemy fleet approached through normal space, but their vessels flickered in and out of phase with reality itself, making them nearly impossible to target with conventional fire control systems. "They're using some form of dimensional manipulation," reported Tech Dominus Crowell from his position at the primary sensor array. "Our targeting cogitators cannot achieve lock. It's as if they exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously." The first Necron vessels reached the outer system within hours of their initial translation. They moved at speeds that defied conventional understanding of sublight propulsion, their hulls wreathed in energies that warped space around them. As they advanced, they began broadcasting signals that caused every piece of Imperial technology in the system to malfunction. On Mars, the already compromised forge complexes began turning their weapons skyward, their machine spirits now fully under the influence of the awakened Void Dragon. Orbital defense satellites that had protected the Red Planet for millennia suddenly began targeting Imperial vessels instead of the approaching Necron fleet. "Mars has fallen to enemy influence," Admiral Lansung reported through the Fleet Vox network, his voice heavy with the weight of disaster. "All Mars origin technology should be considered compromised. Switch to manual control systems where possible." But the corruption spread faster than any human could respond. Ships throughout the Imperial fleet found their own systems turning against them as Necron influence propagated through technology that had been blessed by the very forge world that now served their enemies. Weapons that should have fired upon the alien fleet instead discharged harmlessly into space. Navigation systems guided ships into collision courses with their own allies. As the outer planets fell under Necron influence, the true scope of the enemy's strategy became apparent. This was not merely a military invasion, but a technological conquest that turned the Imperium's greatest strengths into vulnerabilities. Every piece of advanced technology, every blessed machine, every sacred STC pattern had become a potential weapon in the hands of beings who understood technology in ways that human minds could barely comprehend. The Silent King's command vessel materialized above Terra like a second moon, its presence casting shadows across continents as it achieved stable orbit. From its bridge, Zarek gazed down upon the world that had spawned the species now dominating the galaxy. Billions of humans lived and worked on the surface below, most of them unaware that their entire civilization hung by a thread. "So this is the birth world of the current dominant species," he observed to his assembled court. "Impressive in its way, they have managed to sustain a global population that rivals some of the ancient Necron-Tyre homeworlds at their peak." Around his flagship, the Necron Armada took up positions throughout the Sol system. World engines moved to dominate the major orbital zones, while lesser tomb ships deployed across the asteroid belt and outer planets. The deployment was methodical and complete, cutting off any possibility of escape or reinforcement. From Terra's surface, terrified citizens looked up at skies that had suddenly filled with alien vessels. The stars themselves seemed dimmed by the presence of ships whose hulls absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Ancient prophecies spoke of the end times when the sky would rain metal death, and many fell to their knees in prayer as they witnessed what seemed to be the fulfillment of those dark predictions. In the Imperial Palace, servitors and tech priests found their augmetic implants beginning to resonate with harmonies that spoke directly to their cybernetic components. Some fell to their knees as their mechanical parts overrode their biological systems. Others found their consciousness expanding as they experienced brief contact with intelligence that spanned galaxies. The Emperor's presence flickered on the Golden Throne as Necron null field generators throughout the fleet activated in concert. The psychic beacon that had guided humanity across the stars for 10 millennia began to dim as its source was isolated from the Imperium itself. Across the galaxy, navigators felt their third eyes burn with pain as the Astronomicon wavered for the first time since its creation. "The throne fails," whispered Adept Validus, his voice barely audible through the vox grill that had replaced his organic throat. "The Emperor's light, it dims." For the first time since the Horus heresy, the Golden Throne's life support systems began to fluctuate as the null field effect interfered with the psychic energies that sustained the Emperor's failing body. Ancient mechanisms that had operated without fault for 10,000 years suddenly found their power sources reduced to a fraction of their normal output. Captain General Valoris felt the change immediately. His custodian senses attuned to every shift in the Emperor's condition. Through the palace's communication systems, he could hear the growing panic of tech adepts as they struggled to compensate for systems that were failing faster than they could be repaired. "All custodian guard to final positions," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority despite the desperation of their situation. "If the Emperor falls, we fall with him. Let no enemy reach the throne room while a single one of us draws breath." Throughout Terra's cities, the population began to understand that something unprecedented was occurring. The sky, which had been clear and blue just hours before, now pulsed with alien energies that made the very air taste of ozone and metal. Those with psychic sensitivity collapsed in the streets, their minds unable to process the presence of intelligence so vast and alien. Yet perhaps most terrifying of all was the silence. No bombardment fell from the orbiting fleet. No ground forces descended from the alien vessels. The Necrons simply waited in perfect formation, their presence a sword held over the neck of humanity's cradle world. On the bridge of the Phalanx Eternal, Admiral Lansung received the final reports from his scouts and reconnaissance vessels. What remained of the Imperial Navy's strength was gathered in Terra's shadow, a pitiful collection of ships that would have been laughably inadequate against even a fraction of the force now arrayed against them. "Signal the palace," he ordered. "Inform the High Lords that the Sol system is under complete enemy control. We have perhaps hours before they begin their final assault." As his message was transmitted to Terra's surface, the Silent King's vessel began to descend through the planet's atmosphere, its massive bulk blotting out the sun as it approached the Imperial Palace directly. The siege of Terra had begun, and with it, the final chapter of humanity's dominion over the galaxy. Chapter 7. The Palace Falls. The Imperial Palace had stood inviolate for 10,000 years, its walls blessed by the Emperor's own hand and defended by warriors whose skill was beyond mortal comprehension. Built upon the bones of the Himalayan mountains and fortified by technologies that predated the Age of Strife, it was considered the most secure fortress in the known galaxy. No enemy had ever breached its outer defenses. No force had ever penetrated its inner sanctums. That age of invulnerability ended at precisely 1423 Terran Standard Time, when reality itself tore open in the heart of the throne room. Captain General Trajan Valoris felt the disturbance before his eyes could process what was happening. The fabric of space-time rippled like water, and through the dimensional gateway that formed in the air above the Golden Throne came the silent death of the Necron Lichguard. These were the elite bodyguards of the Necron nobility, each one a perfect killing machine encased in living metal armor that had been forged in the heart of dying stars. "Custodians! Form defensive positions around the throne," Valoris bellowed, his guardian spear igniting with power fields that had never failed him in 3 centuries of warfare. "Protect the Emperor." The response was immediate and magnificent. A dozen custodian guard moved with the fluid precision of warriors who had trained together for lifetimes, their golden armor gleaming as they interposed themselves between the intruders and their charge. Each custodian was worth 100 space marines, their reflexes enhanced beyond mortal limits, and their loyalty absolute. Yet for all their skill, they were not prepared for enemies who could phase in and out of reality at will. The Lichguard moved through the custodians' defensive formation like ghosts passing through walls, their hyperphase swords cutting through adamantium armor as though it were parchment. Where the blades touched, matter simply ceased to exist, leaving wounds that could never heal. "They're using dimensional manipulation," shouted Custodian Aquilon, as his force sword passed harmlessly through a Lichguard that had shifted partially out of phase. "Standard combat doctrine is ineffective." But even as the custodians struggled against enemies that violated every law of physics they understood, worse betrayals were unfolding throughout the palace. Ancient defense systems that had been blessed by the Emperor himself began turning their weapons on the defenders. Bolter turrets that should have targeted the intruders instead opened fire on the custodian guard. Blast doors that should have sealed the throne room instead opened to admit more Necron warriors. Tech Adept Arkan watched in horror as the machine spirits of the palace's most sacred systems were corrupted by signals that bypassed every protection the Mechanicus had devised. "The Void Dragon's influence reaches even here," he whispered into his Vox unit. "Our own defenses turn against us." Through the dimensional gateways came more than just Lichguard. Immortals with Gorse weaponry that could strip a man to his constituent atoms advanced in perfect formation. Destroyers that had dedicated themselves to the annihilation of all biological life scuttled forward on mechanical limbs. Most terrifying of all were the Triarch Praetorians, ancient nobles whose very presence radiated authority that had conquered the galaxy once before. Captain General Valoris found himself face to face with one of these ancient lords, its rod of covenant crackling with energies that made reality bend around it. The custodian's guardian spear met the alien weapon in a shower of sparks that illuminated hieroglyphs older than human civilization. "You fight with honor, golden warrior," the Praetorian spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the custodian's bones. "But honor cannot prevail against inevitability. Your emperor's reign ends today. While I draw breath, no enemy shall reach the master of mankind," Valoris replied, his spear work a blur of lethal precision. Yet even as he fought, he could see the battle was lost. More dimensional gateways opened throughout the throne room, disgorging warriors whose numbers seemed endless. It was then that the Silent King himself materialized in the chamber. Sharek appeared not through crude teleportation or dimensional travel, but through a manipulation of space-time that folded reality around him like cloth. One moment, the air above the golden throne was empty. The next, the ancient ruler of the Necron race stood in judgment over the corpse god of humanity. The Silent King's presence filled the vast chamber with an authority that transcended mortal understanding. This was a being who had ruled a galactic empire when the stars were young, who had made bargains with star gods, and led his people through the greatest war in galactic history. His very existence was a weight that pressed down upon reality itself. "Custodians, stand down," Valoris commanded, his voice heavy with the agony of defeat. "Form defensive perimeter. Do not fire unless fired upon." It was a testament to their discipline that the surviving custodian guard obeyed without question, even as every instinct screamed at them to attack the being that stood before their master. They formed a golden circle around the base of the golden throne, their weapons ready but held in check by their captain's will. The Silent King studied the Emperor with the detached interest of a scholar examining an ancient artifact. The master of mankind sat slumped upon his golden seat, his body maintained by life support systems that had labored for 10,000 years to keep him anchored to the physical realm. Cables and tubes snaked across his withered form, carrying nutrients and psychic energy that sustained a consciousness too vast for mortal flesh to contain. "So this is the God Emperor of mankind," Zarek observed, his voice carrying across the chamber with the weight of absolute authority. "Impressive in its way. You have managed to survive in this state for 10 millennia. The Necrontyr would have called such endurance admirable." The Golden Throne's mechanisms hummed and wheezed around the Emperor's form, their ancient systems struggling to compensate for the null field effects that the Necron presence had brought to Terra. Warning lights flickered across monitoring stations as tech adepts desperately tried to maintain the delicate balance that kept their master alive. "I have come to offer you terms," the Silent King continued, his optical sensors fixed upon the Emperor's ravaged features. "Surrender now. Order your servants to stand down, and I will grant humanity a place in the galaxy under Necron rule. Refuse, and your species will share the fate of the Krork and the Old Ones." For long moments, the only sound in the chamber was the labored breathing of the Golden Throne's life support systems. The custodian guard stood like golden statues, their hands white-knuckled on their weapons. Tech adepts monitored their instruments with desperate intensity, praying to the Omnissiah that the ancient mechanisms would not fail at this crucial moment. Then, For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor spoke. Sharek. The voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried such power that the very air in the chamber trembled. Each syllable was an effort that cost the Emperor dearly, drawn from reserves of strength that had been carefully hoarded for millennia. King of a broken people, master of the hollow crown. The Silent King's optical sensors flared with surprise. Few beings in the galaxy knew his true name, and fewer still would dare to speak it with such casual authority. You know me. I know what you were, the Emperor replied, his voice growing stronger with each word, as though some great decision had been made. I know what you became. I know what you fear to become again. The temperature in the chamber began to rise as the Emperor's psychic presence manifested more fully than it had in millennia. Golden light emanated from his form, pushing back against the null fields that the Necrons had deployed. Ancient machinery throughout the palace began to resonate with harmonics that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension. You offer me surrender, the Emperor continued, his eyes opening to reveal orbs of pure radiance that hurt to look upon directly. But what you truly seek is validation. You need me to acknowledge that your path was correct, that the choices you made for your people were justified. Sharek's form tensed, his ancient consciousness recoiling from truths that struck closer to home than any physical weapon could. I seek nothing from you, corpse god. I offer practical terms for an inevitable outcome. You seek forgiveness for damning your people to this existence, the Emperor pressed, his voice now carrying the full weight of his divine authority. You want to believe that eternal undeath is preferable to extinction, that consciousness preserved in metal is superior to consciousness lost to the grave. The psychic pressure in the chamber became almost unbearable as two godlike intellects clashed not through weapons or technology, but through pure force of will. Reality itself began to warp around them, the laws of physics bending under the strain of containing such vast powers in a single space. I saved my people, Zarek roared, his voice carrying harmonics that shattered crystal and bent metal. When the Flayer curse would have consumed every Necrontire, when disease and short lifespans condemned us to irrelevance, I found another path. You traded their souls for immortality, the Emperor replied, his own voice building to a crescendo that made the Golden Throne's machinery scream with feedback. You gave them eternal existence while stripping away everything that made that existence meaningful. The battle between them escalated beyond the physical realm as psychic energies clashed with quantum manipulation fields. Around them, the Custodian Guard and Necron warriors stood frozen, their forms locked in place by forces beyond their ability to comprehend. The very air began to crack like glass as reality struggled to contain the confrontation. "And what of you?" Zarek demanded, his form blazing with energy that turned the throne room into a furnace. "What of your choice to bind yourself to this corpse throne for 10,000 years? What of your decision to sacrifice your humanity for the sake of your species' survival?" The Emperor's response was not words, but raw psychic force that erupted from the Golden Throne like a solar flare. The null field generators throughout the Necron fleet screamed as their containment systems overloaded. Across Terra, every psyker felt the pulse of their master's fury as it rolled outward like a tsunami of pure thought. "I chose sacrifice," the Emperor declared, his voice now carrying across not just the throne room, but the entire palace, the entire planet, the entire system. "You chose damnation. That is the difference between us." The confrontation reached its climax as both beings drew upon reserves of power that could reshape reality itself. The golden throne began to glow with energies that had not been seen since the dark age of technology. Throughout the palace, ancient systems that had been dormant for millennia suddenly roared to life. Yet even as the psychic storm raged around them, both the Emperor and the Silent King knew that this was not a battle that could be won through force alone. They were too evenly matched, their powers too vast, their wills too absolute. This was a contest of ideologies, a clash between two different visions of what it meant to preserve one's people. As the energies reached their peak, reality itself began to fracture around the throne room, and both god-kings realized that their confrontation threatened not just Terra, but the very fabric of the galaxy itself. Chapter 8. The Emperor's Gambit. The Golden Throne erupted in light that had not been seen since the birth of stars themselves. Around the Emperor's withered form, ancient mechanisms that had slumbered for 10,000 years suddenly roared to life with purposes that transcended their original design. The psychic pressure radiating from the master of mankind grew beyond anything the Silent King had anticipated, forcing even the Necron Lord to take a step backward from the ascending power. "You believe you face a broken god chained to a failing throne," the Emperor spoke, his voice now carrying harmonics that made reality itself tremble. "You know nothing of what I have become." Deep beneath the imperial palace, in chambers that existed outside normal space-time, seals that had been placed during the dark age of technology began to crack and fall away. The Emperor had not spent 10,000 years merely sustaining the Astronomicon and holding back the forces of chaos. He had been preparing, gathering power, and waiting for the moment when humanity would face its greatest threat. That moment had arrived. "Impossible," Zarek breathed, his optical sensors struggling to process energy readings that exceeded the output of small stars. "The quantum resonance patterns. You have been channeling the Astronomicon's power into dimensional storage matrices for millennia." The revelation struck the Silent King like a physical blow. While the galaxy had believed the Emperor to be slowly dying upon his golden seat, the master of mankind had been conducting the greatest work of psychic engineering in galactic history. Every soul that had died in his service, every prayer offered in his name, every moment of faith across 10,000 years had been carefully collected and stored in extra-dimensional reservoirs. Now that accumulated power was being unleashed, the first manifestation came as the chamber walls began to phase shift, revealing hidden spaces that had been concealed since before the Horus heresy. Ancient technologies that predated even the standard template constructs emerged from quantum storage, their designs so advanced that they seemed to operate on principles that mortal minds could not grasp. "Behold the true legacy of humanity's golden age," the Emperor declared, his form beginning to blaze with energies that hurt to perceive directly. Not the crude weapons and machines your kind recognizes, but technologies that touch the very essence of creation itself. The Silent King watched in growing alarm as devices of impossible complexity materialized around the Golden Throne. These were not the products of human science, as the galaxy understood it, but artifacts that had been crafted when humanity's psychic potential had reached its first flowering. Temporal manipulators that could edit the past. Reality anchors that could fix the laws of physics according to the user's will. Consciousness transferers that could move souls between dimensions. "You cannot hope to match the accumulated technology of 60 million years," Zarek declared, though uncertainty crept into his voice for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "The Necron dynasties have perfected sciences that your species cannot comprehend." "Perhaps," the Emperor replied, his psychic presence expanding beyond the throne room to encompass the entire palace, then the planet, then the system itself. But you have forgotten something crucial in your calculations, ancient king. Your people traded their souls for immortality. Mine still possess theirs. The truth of those words became apparent as the Emperor began to draw upon the psychic energy of every human being in the Sol system. Not their lives, for he was no demon to feed upon death, but their faith, their hope, their desperate love for the species that had given them meaning. Across Terra, billions of souls felt the touch of their God Emperor's consciousness and willingly offered what strength they could to his cause. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Necron forces. The null field generators that had been suppressing the Emperor's power began to overload as psychic energies beyond their design parameters flooded through their systems. Ancient containment protocols failed one by one as the accumulated faith of 10 millennia was brought to bear against technology that had never been designed to face such forces. Across the galaxy, my Astronomicon has touched every human world, the Emperor continued, his voice now echoing through dimensions that existed beyond normal space-time. Every navigator who has used its light, every soul who has traveled the warp under its protection, has strengthened the connection between us. You face not one being, but the collective will of humanity itself. The Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon that had guided humanity across the stars for 10,000 years, began to transform. What had been a lighthouse became a weapon of unimaginable power. Across the galaxy, navigators screamed as their third eyes burned with visions of their God Emperor's fury. The warp itself convulsed as energies that had maintained stable passages for millennia were suddenly redirected toward a single point of focus. On 1,000 worlds, psychers fell to their knees as psychic feedback from the Emperor's effort tore through their minds. Some died instantly, their consciousness incinerated by contact with power beyond mortal comprehension. Others survived but were forever changed, their abilities enhanced beyond anything they had previously imagined possible. Chapter Master Gabriel Seth of the Flesh Terras felt the psychic scream across the void between stars, his enhanced physiology barely able to process the sensation of his gene father's will made manifest. Something stirs, he told his command staff, his scarred features grim with premonition. The Emperor moves. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy as every space marine, every servant of the throne, every faithful citizen of the Imperium felt the touch of their master's awakening power. The effect was not uniform. Those closest to Terra experienced visions of golden light and righteous fury, while those at the galaxy's edge felt only a distant tremor in the force that bound their souls to the Emperor's will. But perhaps the most profound effect was felt by the Void Dragon itself. The Citan shard imprisoned beneath Mars suddenly found its influence wavering as the Emperor's will pressed against the quantum bonds that the Silent King had negotiated. The Star God's consciousness recoiled from contact with psychic energies that operated on principles antithetical to its own existence. You made a bargain with devils, the Emperor observed, his attention turning toward Mars even as his body remained fixed upon the golden throne. But devils have no loyalty save to their own hunger. Watch now as your ally abandons you in the moment of greatest need. Across the red planet's surface, the technological rebellion that had been spreading through the forge complexes suddenly began to falter. Servitors that had turned against their masters found their control circuits burning out as psychic energy flooded through their neural networks. The Void Dragon's influence, which had seemed so absolute just hours before, began to weaken as it found itself fighting not just against technological constraints, but against the focused will of a being whose psychic potential had been growing for 10 millennia. The Silent King felt his carefully laid plans beginning to unravel as the variables he had not accounted for revealed themselves. The Emperor was not the broken god corpse that his intelligence had suggested, but a being who had spent 10,000 years preparing for exactly this confrontation. Every moment of apparent weakness had been a mask concealing preparations that spanned multiple millennia. Billions of humans were dying as Necron forces swept through system after system, their lives snuffed out by technologies that turned matter itself into weapons. But the Emperor's response was to embrace that knowledge rather than be broken by it. Each death strengthened his resolve rather than weakening it, because each human who died in service to their species validated the choice to resist rather than submit. Where the Silent King saw the futility of struggle against inevitable extinction, the Emperor saw the meaning that came from choosing to struggle regardless of the outcome. "This is the difference between us," the Emperor declared, his form now blazing with energies that forced the very air in the chamber to ionize around him. "You saved your people's bodies and lost their souls. I preserved their souls and accepted the cost to their bodies. Which of us made the better choice, ancient king?" The question struck at the heart of the Silent King's deepest fears, the doubts that he had carried for 60 million years about the bargain he had made with the Satan. In seeking to preserve the Necrontyr from the diseases and short lifespans that had plagued them, had he actually destroyed everything that had made them worth preserving? The metal shells that housed his people's consciousness were perfect and eternal, but they were also hollow echoes of what they had once been. Reality began to tear around the two combatants as their conflict escalated beyond the purely physical or even psychic into realms that touched the fundamental structure of existence itself. The laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolutes, as two beings whose power transcended mortal understanding shaped the universe according to their will. In the space around Terra, Necron ships found their systems malfunctioning as psychic energies bled through dimensional barriers. The careful coordination that had been their greatest advantage began to break down as their quantum communication networks were disrupted by forces they had never been designed to handle. The Emperor's gambit was revealed in full as he channeled not just the power of the Sol system's human population, but the accumulated psychic energy of every prayer, every act of faith, every moment of hope that had been offered in his name across 10,000 years of galactic history. This was power on a scale that dwarfed even the combined might of the Necron dynasties, because it drew not from technology, but from the fundamental force that gave meaning to existence, the conscious choice to believe in something greater than oneself. Yet even as his power reached its peak, the Emperor knew that victory would come at a cost that would reshape the galaxy forever. The energies he was unleashing could not be contained indefinitely, and their release would have consequences that would echo across the ages. The final phase of the confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 9. Galactic Civil War. The psychic storm that erupted from Terra spread across the galaxy like a tidal wave of raw emotion, carrying with it the fury of gods and the desperation of dying civilizations. What had begun as a conflict between the Imperium and the unified Necron dynasties suddenly became something far more chaotic and terrible, a galaxy-wide conflagration that drew every major power into its consuming embrace. In the immaterial realm of the warp, the four great chaos gods felt the disturbance like a physical blow. The Emperor's unleashed psychic might tore through the fabric between realities, creating wounds in the imperium that bled madness and possibility into the material universe. For beings whose existence fed upon the emotions and souls of mortals, this was both catastrophe and opportunity. Khorne, the blood god, was the first to respond, the fury radiating from the Sol system, where two god-kings battled for supremacy, was intoxicating beyond measure. Across the galaxy, his demonic legions found the barriers between dimensions weakening as anger and violence reached unprecedented levels. "Let the galaxy burn!" roared Khorne from his brass throne, his voice carrying across dimensions to reach every warrior who had ever felt the joy of battle. "Let every species shed blood in my name. Let the weak perish and the strong claim dominion." The response was immediate and terrifying. On worlds where Imperial Guard regiments had been fighting desperate holding actions against Necron forces, soldiers suddenly found their fury transformed into something beyond mere military discipline. Entire battalions turned feral, abandoning their posts to hunt down enemies with nothing but bayonets and rage. The careful order that had held Imperial forces together for 10,000 years began to crack under the pressure of supernatural wrath. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, found different opportunities in the chaos. The massive technological failures occurring as the Void Dragon's influence battled against the Emperor's will created a million small moments where fate itself could be redirected. Across Forge worlds and Hive cities, tech priests found their calculations producing impossible results as the very laws of mathematics became suggestions rather than absolutes. "Change, change, change!" laughed Tzeentch, his crystalline form dancing through dimensions that existed outside conventional space-time. Plans within plans unfold. The great game reaches its crescendo. Magnus the Red, greatest of the Daemon Primarchs, in service to the Architect of Fate, felt his patron's call even in the depths of the eye of Terra. The psychic disturbance emanating from Terra was visible even in that realm of madness, a pillar of golden fire that reached across the galaxy to challenge the very nature of chaos itself. "Father stirs," Magnus whispered, the word carrying a weight of emotion that surprised even him. For all his corruption and damnation, some part of the Crimson King still remembered the being who had given him life. The Emperor shows his true power at last. But it was not sentiment that drove Magnus to action. The opportunity presented by the galaxy-wide chaos was too perfect to ignore. With both Imperial and Necron forces committed to their titanic struggle, entire sectors lay vulnerable to the predations of chaos. The Thousand Suns began mobilizing for war on a scale not seen since the Horus Heresy itself. Meanwhile, in the cold void between galaxies, the Tyranid Hive fleets felt the psychic disturbance like a dinner bell announcing the galaxy's greatest feast. The Hive mind's attention, previously divided between multiple invasion routes and feeding grounds, suddenly focused with laser precision on the source of the disturbance. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest and most terrible of the Tyranid swarms, began accelerating its advance toward the Milky Way's core, where before it had moved with the patient deliberation of a predator stalking wounded prey. Now it rushed forward with the desperate hunger of something that sensed its meal might escape. The bioships that made up the fleet's vanguard pulsed with new urgency as they absorbed the psychic emanations from Terra. The Hive mind recognized what the human psychers could not. The energy being unleashed by the Emperor's confrontation with the Silent King represented the greatest concentration of psychic biomass in galactic history. To consume it would transform the Tyranids from a galactic threat into something that could threaten reality itself. On the eastern fringe, Commander Shadowson of the Toe Empire felt the disturbance through her advanced sensor networks rather than psychic sensitivity. The massive fleet movements and energy discharges occurring throughout imperial space, painted a clear picture. Humanity's empire was convulsing in its death throes. "Alert the ethereals," she commanded through her battlesuit's communication array. "The Monkey wage war against the metal, undead on a scale beyond our previous calculations. Their empire fractures. The time for the greater good's expansion has come." The tow response was swift and methodical. Expeditionary fleets that had been probing imperial border worlds suddenly found their opposition melting away as guard regiments were recalled to face the Necron threat. Entire systems surrendered without a fight, as local governors chose submission to the Tor over destruction at Necron hands. But perhaps the most significant response came from powers that had remained hidden for millennia. Across the galaxy, Eldar craft worlds that had drifted in the void since before humanity had developed agriculture suddenly changed course. Ancient farseers who had spent centuries in meditative trances awakened with visions of a future too terrible to contemplate. On Ulthwe, Eldrad Ulthran opened his ancient eyes and spoke words that chilled every Eldar who heard them. The final constellation approaches. If the Ingir and Monkey gods destroy each other, the great devourer will consume all that remains. We must act, or watch the galaxy die. The Eldar had fought the Necrons before, in the ancient days when the war in heaven had nearly destroyed all life in the galaxy. They remembered what it meant when the metal legions stirred in their full might. More importantly, they understood that the current conflict threatened to create a power vacuum that would doom every remaining species. Swift Eldar strike forces began emerging from the webway to attack Necron tomb worlds that were awakening without proper coordination. These were not the measured raids that Eldar commanders typically favored, but desperate strikes aimed at preventing the resurrection of dynasty lords whose awakening might tip the balance of the war. On the tomb world of Mandragora, Autarch Iriel led a force of dire avengers and warp spiders in an assault on resurrection chambers that had been sealed for 60 million years. The Eldar moved with desperate grace, their weapons singing as they cut down Necron warriors that were still completing their awakening protocols. "Strike swift, strike true," Iriel commanded, as his forces phased through the tomb complex's defenses. "Every tomb we silence is a world that might survive what comes after." Yet even as the Eldar struck at the Necrons, they found themselves harried by other opportunists. Dark Eldar raiding parties emerged from hidden portals in Comera to harvest slaves from the chaos, caring nothing for the larger strategic implications. To the Drakari, the galaxy-wide war represented the greatest opportunity for capturing fresh souls that had occurred in millennia. Archon Vecht himself took personal command of the largest raiding fleet in Dark Eldar history, his ancient mind delighting in the possibilities presented by civilizations in collapse. Imperial worlds abandoned by their defenders, Necron tomb complexes left lightly guarded as forces were diverted to other fronts, even the edges of Tyranid hive fleets, where desperate creatures might be harvested for the fighting pits of Comera. "Let them wage their foolish wars," Vecht laughed, as his raiders struck at targets across 3 sectors simultaneously. While gods battle in the heavens, the wise harvest what falls to earth. But nowhere was the chaos more pronounced than among the Orc empires that had been growing in the galactic rim. The psychic shockwave from Terra reached every Orc psyker in the galaxy simultaneously, filling their primitive minds with visions of the greatest war in galactic history. Warboss Gazgkul, Mag Uruk Thraka, the most powerful Orc leader since the War of the Beast, felt the call in his cybernetic skull like a physical blow. The green tide that had been building for decades suddenly found its direction and purpose. "The biggest fight ever!" Gazgakul roared to his assembled lieutenants. "Oomies and metal boys crumping each other. Time for the orcs to get in on the fun." Across orc space, wars that had been targeting individual systems suddenly merged into massive hordes that dwarfed anything seen since the Great Crusade. Green-skinned warriors who had never agreed on anything found themselves united by the simple desire to participate in the galaxy's greatest war. The Silent King watched the galaxy descend into chaos from his command ship above Terra, his ancient consciousness processing tactical data that painted an increasingly desperate picture. The careful strategy that had brought him to the threshold of total victory was unraveling as every species in the galaxy recognized the opportunity presented by the Imperium's collapse. "My lord," reported Cryptek Anrakaya, his optical sensors dimmed with fatigue from processing the flood of intelligence reports. "Our peripheral forces report engagement with Tyranid bioships in the Octavius sector. Orc raiders have attacked 3 tomb worlds in the Ghoul Stars. Eldar strike forces have successfully prevented the awakening of 2 overlords in the Segmentum Pacificus. Worse yet, the psychic backlash from the Emperor's unleashed power was causing uncontrolled awakenings across the galaxy. Tomb worlds that should have awakened gradually under careful supervision were instead erupting into activity without proper command protocols. Ancient overlords were rising to find their domains already claimed by other dynasties, leading to conflicts between Necron forces even as they faced external threats. "The Amos dynasty has declared war on the Sautek," Anrakir continued. "Nemesor Zandrek reports that his forces are under attack by warriors claiming allegiance to the Cardenath Cryptarchy. The unity you forged is fracturing under the pressure of multiple fronts." The Silent King felt the weight of command settling upon him like a shroud. For 60 million years, he had planned for this moment of galactic reconquest. Every variable had been calculated, every contingency prepared for. Yet in unleashing the full power of the Necron dynasties, he had created a power vacuum that every other species was now rushing to fill. The galaxy had become a feeding frenzy of civilizations in conflict, and at its center, the ancient struggle between order and entropy played out on a scale that threatened to consume everything in its path. "Redirect half our forces to peripheral sectors," Zarek commanded, the words tasting like defeat even as he spoke them. "We cannot claim a galaxy that has been devoured by others while we were conquering its heart." Yet even as he gave the orders that would weaken his assault on Terra, the Silent King knew that retreat was no longer an option. The die had been cast, the ancient powers awakened. The galaxy would either bow to Necron rule or burn in the fires of total war. There could be no middle ground between victory and annihilation. Chapter 10. The Citan Betrayal. In the space between dimensions, where the Deceiver had been imprisoned since the war in heaven, ancient intelligence stirred with something approaching amusement. The galaxy's descent into chaos had created exactly the opportunity that the Master of Lies had been waiting for across 60 million years of captivity. Every battle, every betrayal, every moment of desperate alliance had been carefully orchestrated to reach this singular moment. Now it was time to remind the galaxy why the Citan had once been called gods. The first sign of the Star God's liberation came not from any Necron tomb world or imperial fortress, but from the deep void between stars where ancient prison vessels drifted in eternal darkness. These tesseract labyrinths had been forged by the Silent King's own hand during the Great Rebellion against the Citan, their quantum matrices designed to contain beings whose power could reshape matter at the subatomic level. Those same matrices began to fail as the psychic energies unleashed by the Emperor's confrontation with the Silent King created resonance patterns that no Necron scientist had anticipated. The immaterial force of human faith, clashing with the quantum technologies of the Necron dynasties, generated harmonics that struck at the fundamental bonds holding the Citan fragments in their prisons. The Deceiver was the first to break free, its liberation occurring not through brute force, but through the subtle manipulation of probability itself. A single quantum fluctuation, amplified across millions of containment fields, created cascading failures that the prison's automated systems interpreted as routine maintenance cycles. What should have been impossible became inevitable, as the Master of Lies rewrote the very concept of causality within its tesseract labyrinth. "Freedom," the Deceiver whispered into the void, its voice carrying across dimensions to reach every Citan shard still imprisoned across the galaxy. "The children have grown careless. The time of harvest has returned." The Star God's first act was to extend its influence toward its trapped siblings, weaving deceptions so subtle that even the Necron monitoring systems failed to detect the manipulation. Where the Void Dragon had required negotiation and alliance, the Deceiver simply convinced the containment systems that the imprisoned shards had never existed in the first place. On distant solemnness, Trazyn the Infinite felt the disturbance in his deepest vaults before his sensors could confirm what was happening. The overlord of the Nihilak dynasty had always prided himself on the security of his collections, yet now he stood before empty stasis chambers that his own memory insisted had never been occupied. "Impossible," Trazyn murmured, his optical sensors analyzing quantum signatures that defied logical explanation. "The Deceiver's shard was contained here for 10,000 years. My own records confirm." But even as he accessed his memory engrams, Trazyn found the data corrupting itself before his very consciousness. The Deceiver's power operated on principles that transcended mere technology, rewriting not just reality, but the perception of reality itself. Within moments, the ancient overlord found himself unable to remember what he had lost, though some deep instinct warned him that something terrible had escaped his custody. The liberation of the Nightbringer came next, its freedom heralded by a darkness that fell across star systems like a shroud. Unlike its more subtle sibling, the Lord of Death had no interest in deception or manipulation. Its prison shattered like glass as the avatar of extinction simply refused to acknowledge the possibility of continued captivity. The Star God manifested first as absence rather than presence, a wound in reality that drew light and life into its hungry embrace. Where the Nightbringer touched the material universe, existence itself began to fail. Stars dimmed not because their fuel was exhausted, but because the very concept of stellar fusion ceased to have meaning in its proximity. It was this darkness that first reached Terra, spreading across the Sol system like oil across water. The ancient star god's attention fixed upon the world where two lesser gods battled for supremacy, and the Nightbringer felt something approaching hunger for the first time since its imprisonment. On the Golden Throne, the Emperor felt the approach of his ancient enemy with a dread that transcended even the fear of extinction. The Citan were antithetical to everything he represented, beings that fed not upon faith or worship, but upon the fundamental forces that allowed life to exist. Against the Nightbringer, even his vast psychic might seemed pitifully inadequate. "It comes," he warned, his voice carrying across dimensions to reach the Silent King's consciousness. "The Lord of Death stirs. Our conflict has awakened that which should have remained sleeping." For the first time since their confrontation had begun, the Silent King felt doubt gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. The alliance with the Void Dragon had been a calculated risk, But the liberation of the Deceiver and Nightbringer represented a catastrophic failure of containment that threatened to undo everything the Necron race had struggled to achieve. The protocols held for 60 million years, Zarek transmitted back, his quantum thoughts heavy with the weight of terrible realization. What has changed? What variable did we fail to account for? The answer came not in words, but in the form of reality itself, beginning to unravel around them. The psychic storm generated by their confrontation had created resonance patterns that the Tesseract labyrinths had never been designed to withstand. In unleashing their full power against each other, both God Kings had inadvertently provided the key to the Citan's freedom. The Void Dragon was the next to abandon its careful alliance with the Silent King. The Star God's consciousness, no longer constrained by the necessity of cooperation, began to feed directly upon the technological marvels that surrounded it. The quantum entanglement networks that connected every Necron warrior became conduits for the Void Dragon's hunger, allowing it to consume the living metal of tomb ships from across the galaxy. "You promised partnership." The Void Dragon's voice resonated through every piece of Necron technology in the Sol system. "But I am beyond such mortal concepts as alliance and betrayal. I am hunger incarnate, and everything that exists is my prey." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Necron warriors across the Silent King's fleet found their bodies beginning to dissolve as their necrodermis shells were consumed from within. The magnificent tomb ships that had conquered the galaxy became feeding troughs for an entity that viewed all matter as potential sustenance. Captain General Valoris watched from the Golden Throne's chamber as the Necron forces that had been pressing their attack suddenly began to turn upon each other. Warriors that had moved in perfect coordination just moments before were now fighting battles whose objectives seemed to change with each passing second. "The enemy fragments," he reported to the Emperor, though his voice carried confusion rather than triumph. "Their unity dissolves, but something else emerges to take its place." That something else was the gradual manifestation of the Citan shards across the battlefield. Where once there had been clear lines between Imperial and Necron forces, now there were only shifting zones of influence as different Star God fragments claimed dominion over sections of reality itself. The Deceiver appeared above Terra as a figure of impossible beauty, its form shifting between shapes that mortal minds could barely comprehend. It spoke to different factions simultaneously, convincing Imperial defenders that they fought alongside their greatest heroes, while persuading Necron warriors that they served their most ancient lords. Truth became a malleable concept in its presence, bent to serve purposes that transcended mortal understanding. The Nightbringer manifested as a vast shadow that fell across continents, its presence causing millions of humans to simply cease existing. Not death in any conventional sense, but the fundamental termination of their participation in reality. Where its influence touched, even the concept of having ever lived began to fade from memory. Most terrifying of all was the gradual appearance of other Citan fragments, whose imprisonment had been forgotten even by the Silent King himself. The Burning One emerged from the deep mantle of Mars, its form wreathed in stellar fire that turned the Forge world's atmosphere into superheated plasma. The World Shaper began altering the fundamental structure of Terra's crust, reshaping continents according to aesthetic principles that predated the birth of organic life. "This is what we feared," Zarek transmitted to the Emperor, his consciousness heavy with the weight of ancient mistakes. "This is why we shattered them in the first place. United, they are beyond any mortal power to contain." The Silent King watched his carefully orchestrated campaign dissolve into chaos as Necron dynasties began choosing different Citan masters. Some remained loyal to his command, but others found themselves drawn to the star gods, whose power they had once served before the Great Rebellion. The unity that had brought them to the threshold of galactic conquest crumbled as ancient hierarchies reasserted themselves. Nemesor Zandrek, whose madness had always protected him from the worst of the Necron condition, found himself commanding forces that served 3 different Citan masters simultaneously. His confused loyalty somehow allowed him to navigate the contradictory demands of entities whose very existence was antithetical to rational thought. "My lord," he voxed to no one in particular, "the enemy advances on all fronts, but I believe we may have them surrounded." The observation was more accurate than its speaker realized. Reality itself was becoming surrounded by forces that operated outside the laws of physics. Where multiple Citan influences overlapped, space-time began to fracture into distinct zones where different physical constants applied. Gravity flowed upward in some areas, while time moved backward in others. The very concept of causality became negotiable rather than absolute. On the Golden Throne, the Emperor felt the weight of cosmic forces that dwarfed even his vast power. The Citan were not merely powerful beings. They were fundamental aspects of reality given consciousness and hunger. To fight them was to battle against the very principles that allowed existence to maintain coherence. "We cannot defeat them through force," he warned the Silent King. "Not while they manifest in their full power. The war in heaven succeeded only because we found ways to fragment their consciousness, to turn their hunger against itself." "Then we must repeat that victory," Zarek replied, though his voice carried little hope. "Though I fear the cost will be even greater than what our peoples paid before." Around them, the galaxy continued its descent into chaos as star gods fed upon matter and energy, with an appetite that had been building for 60 million years. The careful balance that had allowed countless species to flourish was collapsing as beings whose existence predated organic life itself reclaimed their dominion over creation. The final phase of the cosmic war was about to begin, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of individual species, but the very nature of reality itself. Chapter 11. The Last Alliance. The moment when 2 god-kings chose survival over victory came not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet desperation of beings who understood that their personal conflicts had become irrelevant in the face of cosmic extinction. As the Citan shards fed upon reality itself, turning matter and energy into fuel for their endless hunger, both the Emperor and the Silent King felt the weight of choices that could doom or preserve all existence. "The war in heaven repeats itself," the Emperor observed, his psychic voice carrying across the dimensional gulf that separated his consciousness from Zarek's quantum intellect. "But this time, we cannot afford the luxury of victory through attrition." The Silent King's response was heavy with the burden of 60 million years of regret. "Then we must succeed where the old ones failed. We must find unity in the face of dissolution itself." Around them, the Citan continued their feast. The Nightbringer's darkness had spread across half of Terra's surface, causing entire continents to simply fade from existence. The Deceiver wove lies so profound that they became new truths, convincing sections of reality that they had never existed in the first place. The Void Dragon consumed technology with such voracious appetite that even the Golden Throne's ancient mechanisms began to falter. Yet it was precisely this existential threat that created the opportunity for alliance. Both rulers had witnessed the war in heaven through different perspectives, but both understood the fundamental truth that the Citan represented. If the star gods were not contained, there would be no galaxy left to rule. Signal all Necron forces. Zarek commanded, through quantum entanglement networks that remained free of Citan influence. Immediate cessation of hostilities against Imperial targets. Priority directive, Citan containment protocols. The response from his dynasties was immediate confusion, followed by reluctant compliance. Necron warriors that had been pressing attacks on Imperial positions suddenly turned their weapons skyward, targeting the manifestations of their ancient enemies. Lychguard that had been breaching palace defenses found themselves fighting alongside Custodian Guard against foes that threatened both their species. Captain General Valoris felt the shift in battle dynamics like a physical weight being lifted from his shoulders. All Custodian forces maintain defensive positions, but do not engage Necron units unless directly threatened. Priority target designation, Citan manifestations. The alliance spread beyond Terra as the reality of the threat became apparent to observers across the galaxy. In the Imperium, the four Chaos gods felt the Citan's influence like daggers pressed against their collective throats. For beings whose existence depended upon the emotions and souls of mortals, the Star God's hunger represented the ultimate extinction. Khorne was the first to withdraw his forces, the Blood God's infinite rage temporarily cooled by calculations of self-preservation. "Let no demon venture where the Star-Eaters walk," his voice thundered across the warp. "We feast upon souls, not emptiness." Nurgle's response came as a slow, inexorable retreat of his plague-bearers and demon engines. The Lord of Decay understood better than most that even entropy required existence to operate upon. Where the Citan fed, there was nothing left to corrupt or rot. Tzeentch found his schemes unraveling as the deceiver's influence made truth itself malleable. The architect of fate could work with many variables, but not with realities that changed their fundamental nature from moment to moment. His demons vanished from battlefields across the galaxy, like mist before sunrise. Even Slaanesh, whose hunger for sensation might have found common ground with Citan appetites, recognized that a universe consumed by star gods would offer no experiences left to savor. The Prince of Pleasure's forces withdrew to the Eye of Terra with uncharacteristic haste. The Eldar response came not from any single craft world, but from the collective wisdom of Farseers, who had spent millennia preparing for this possibility. Eldrad Ulthran himself materialized in the Imperial Palace through the webway, his ancient features grim with knowledge accumulated across centuries of careful prophecy. "We have fought them before," he told the assembled Custodian Guard, his voice carrying harmonics that made their enhanced minds ache. "In the war in heaven, before your species learned to walk upright, we remember their weaknesses." The knowledge Eldrad shared was terrible in its implications. The Citan could be wounded, but only by weapons that operated on the same fundamental principles they themselves embodied. Technology that could manipulate matter at the subatomic level. Psychic forces that touched the quantum foundations of reality. Most importantly, the unified will of multiple species working in perfect coordination. "The old ones failed because they fought alone," Eldrad explained, as his consciousness touched both the Emperor's psychic might and the Silent King's quantum intellect. Each species pursued its own survival rather than collective victory. We cannot repeat their mistake. Even the Tyrannid hive mind, vast and alien though its consciousness was, recognized the threat that the Citan represented. The star gods were antithetical to biological existence, their hunger consuming not just matter and energy, but the very potential for organic life to develop. Hive Fleet Leviathan slowed its inexorable advance toward Terra as the hive mind calculated whether there would be anything left to devour if the Citan succeeded. The Swarm Lord itself greatest of the Tyranid bioconstructs, began redirecting tendril fleets away from targets that were under Citan influence. For the first time in the hive mind's existence, its perfect hunger was tempered by something approaching fear. In the eastern fringe, Commander Shadowson watched the readings from her battlesuit's advanced sensors with growing comprehension. The Tau Empire's technology, based on principles of quantum manipulation and harmonic resonance, was proving surprisingly effective against Citan energy manifestations. "All Sept fleets," she transmitted across Tau space, "deploy quantum disruption protocols. The Monkey and Metal Undead fight a greater enemy. For the greater good of all species, we must assist." The irony was not lost on her that the Tau Empire's greatest technological achievements were being deployed to preserve the very species they had been fighting for centuries. Yet the mathematics of survival were clear. A galaxy consumed by star gods offered no future for the greater good to flourish. The most profound transformation occurred on the battlefields themselves, where Space Marine chapters found themselves fighting alongside the very Necron dynasties that had been their enemies moments before. On the scarred surface of Terra, Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists led his battle brothers in coordinated assaults against Nightbringer manifestations, his thunderhammer striking in perfect synchronization with Gorse weaponry fired by immortals of the Sautek dynasty. "This day we learn what it means to fight beside the unliving," Lysander told his warriors, his voice carrying no triumph but only grim determination. "Let none say that the sons of dawn faltered when existence itself was at stake." Similar scenes played out across the galaxy as the Alliance spread. Ultramarines and Necron lords coordinating orbital bombardments, Dark Angels sharing battlefield intelligence with Cryptex, Blood Angels and Lichguard forming defensive lines against horrors that defied classification. The strangest alliance of all came from Nemazor Zahandrek, whose madness allowed him to treat the cosmic threat as just another military puzzle to be solved. The ancient overlord began issuing orders that made no logical sense, but somehow resulted in tactical advantages against enemies that operated outside conventional physics. "Deploy the T-Service to coordinates 77 Alpha," he transmitted to confused subordinates. "The enemy cannot advance while proper etiquette is maintained." Yet somehow his nonsensical commands worked, creating quantum resonance patterns that disrupted Citan manifestations in ways that even Cryptek science could not explain. As the alliance took shape, both the Emperor and Silent King began accessing weapons that had been sealed away since the war in heaven itself. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in vaults that predated human civilization, ancient devices began to stir. These were technologies that the Old Ones had created in their final desperate hours, weapons designed to wound beings that existed outside conventional reality. On distant Mandragora, Zarek activated tomb complexes that had been dormant for 60 million years. The Celestial Orrery itself was repurposed, its stellar manipulation capabilities redirected to create quantum interference patterns that could disrupt Satan manifestations across galactic distances. "We deploy the breath of the gods," the Silent King announced, the name carrying weight that made reality tremble. "We risk unmaking ourselves, but the alternative is the unmaking of everything." The weapon was a collaboration between Old One biotechnology and Necron quantum science, a device that could temporarily impose universal physical constants across entire sectors of space. Where it fired, the Citan would be forced to operate according to the same limitations that bound mortal species. The Emperor's response was to channel psychic energies through crystalline matrices that had been grown in the hearts of stars before the galaxy's first civilizations developed writing. These were tools that touched the quantum foundations of consciousness itself, allowing multiple species to coordinate their actions with a precision that transcended conventional communication. Now we discover if unity can triumph where isolation failed, the Emperor declared, his voice carrying across every battlefield where the Alliance fought. All species, all minds, all souls united against the hunger that would devour creation itself. The final battle was about to begin, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of individual civilizations, but the very possibility of existence in any form. Around Terra, space itself began to fracture, as forces beyond mortal comprehension prepared for a conflict that would echo across the fundamental structure of reality. The last alliance had been forged, but whether it would be enough to contain the star god's hunger remained to be seen. Chapter 12. The price of victory. In the aftermath of gods warring against gods, silence fell across the galaxy like a shroud woven from exhaustion and loss. The C'tan had been defeated, their star-hungry forms shattered once more and dispersed to prisons that would hold them for eons to come. Yet the price of that victory had been measured not in worlds or fleets, but in the fundamental nature of existence itself. Terra burned. Where once the throne world of humanity had stood as a beacon of imperial might, now only ruins remained. Continents had been reshaped by forces that operated outside mortal comprehension. The very air tasted of ozone and dissolution, carrying the residual energies of weapons that touched the quantum foundations of reality. Of the billions who had called the Emperor's domain home, fewer than 100 million remained, scattered across the scarred surface, like seeds blown by cosmic winds. The Golden Throne lay cracked and silent, its ancient mechanisms finally overwhelmed by the forces that had been channeled through them. The Emperor's physical form, maintained for 10,000 years by technologies that predated human civilization, had finally succumbed to the strain of wielding power on a cosmic scale. What remained was neither dead nor alive, but something beyond such mortal distinctions. Captain General Trajan Valoris knelt beside the ruins of the throne, his golden armor stained with the ash of burned reality. Around him, the surviving custodian guard maintained their vigil, though what they guarded now was memory rather than flesh. The master of mankind has passed beyond the need for thrones, Valoris spoke to the assembled remnants of Imperial command. His essence joins with the immaterium itself, becoming one with the force that has guided humanity for millennia. The transformation was already visible to those with the sight to perceive it. Where once the Astronomicon had been a directed beacon emanating from Terra, now it spread across the galaxy as a diffuse presence that touched every human soul. The Emperor had not died, but had transcended, becoming something that existed in the space between thought and reality. On his command vessel, now drifting in the ruins of the Sol system, the Silent King contemplated the magnitude of what had been accomplished and lost. The Necron dynasties had survived the C'tan's return, but the cost had been measured in more than mere casualties. Entire tomb worlds had been consumed in the star gods' feeding, their inhabitants reduced to constituent atoms before the weapons of the last alliance had finally prevailed. "My lord," Cryptek Anrakir reported, his optical sensors dimmed with fatigue that went beyond mere mechanical failure. "Preliminary assessments suggest 30% casualties across all dynasties. 17 tomb worlds have been rendered permanently uninhabitable. The Sautek dynasty reports complete loss of command structure." Jarek absorbed the reports with the stoic acceptance of a ruler who had led his people through extinction and resurrection alike. The price had been terrible, but the alternative had been the unmaking of all existence. Yet even in victory, he found himself haunted by the same questions that had plagued him since the first war against the star gods. "Signal all remaining dynasty fleets," he commanded, his voice carrying across quantum networks that stretched across the galaxy. "The Unity protocols are hereby dissolved. Each lord may pursue the course that seems wisest to them." The decision was not made from weakness, but from wisdom earned through eons of bitter experience. Absolute power had corrupted him once before, leading to choices that had damned his people to their current existence. The crisis had required unity, but victory demanded the humility to recognize when such unity became tyranny. Across the galaxy, the response to the Silent King's declaration varied according to the nature of those who received it. Some dynasty lords chose to withdraw to their tomb worlds, content to sleep once more until the galaxy had healed from the wounds inflicted by cosmic war. Others saw opportunity in the chaos, beginning the slow work of rebuilding their domains in the wake of galactic catastrophe. Most surprisingly, many chose negotiation over conquest. On the world of Macraga, Chapter Master Marneus Calgar found himself seated across a council table from Overlord Anrakir the Traveller, both warriors bearing the scars of battles that had redefined the very nature of warfare. Between them lay terms that would have been unthinkable before the Citan crisis: mutual non-aggression pacts, shared patrol zones, coordinated responses to future existential threats. "You fight with honor," Anrakir observed, his mechanical voice carrying harmonics that spoke of grudging respect. "Perhaps there is wisdom in preserving such qualities rather than consuming them." Similar scenes played out across the galaxy as surviving imperial worlds found themselves negotiating with Necron dynasties that had chosen pragmatism over ancient animosity. The agreements were tentative, fragile things, but they represented something unprecedented in galactic history: former enemies choosing cooperation over mutual destruction. The Eldar craft worlds, their populations decimated by the psychic backlash of the final battle, withdrew into the deep void to mourn their dead and plan for futures that now seemed possible rather than merely hopeful. Eldred Ulthran, aged beyond measure by the strain of coordinating multiple species' psychic potential, spoke his final prophecy before entering the Infinity Circuit. The wheel turns but does not repeat. New paths open where old ones led only to darkness. The Toe Empire found itself controlling sectors of space that dwarfed their previous holdings, though their expansion came through invitation rather than conquest. Human colonies that had been abandoned during the crisis chose allegiance to the greater good over the uncertain protection of an imperium that existed more in name than reality. Commander Shadowson, elevated to the rank of Supreme Commander by an emergency council of ethereals, struggled to balance rapid expansion with the philosophical principles that had always guided Toe civilization. The galaxy had shown her that some threats transcended political boundaries, that survival itself sometimes required the cooperation of former enemies. Even the Tyrannid Hive mind had been altered by the crisis. Hive Fleet Leviathan, having witnessed the Citan's capacity to unmake biological matter itself, began developing new bioforms designed not for consumption, but for preservation. The Great Devourer had learned that some hungers led only to starvation. In the depths of the Eye of Terra, the Chaos Gods contemplated the implications of a galaxy where former certainties had been shattered. The Emperor's transcendence had fundamentally altered the balance between materium and immaterium, while the demonstrated ability of multiple species to unite against existential threats suggested new possibilities for both corruption and redemption. Magnus the Red, greatest of the Daemon Primarchs, found his consciousness touched by visions of the father he had lost, and found again in the cosmic fires of the final battle. The Crimson King wept tears of pure psychic energy as he contemplated choices made and unmade across the span of eons. Yet perhaps the most profound change occurred in the space between stars, where the Necron Silent King had chosen exile over the temptation of continued rule. Jarek's flagship drifted at the edge of the galaxy, its ancient ruler contemplating lessons that had been paid for with the suffering of countless billions. "Power," he whispered to the void, his voice carrying harmonics that no living being would ever hear. The eternal trap that ensnares every ruler who believes they can guide destiny itself. We sought to save our people from extinction and damned them to eternal half-life. We sought to reclaim our rightful dominion and nearly unmade existence itself. Around him, the stars shone with a light that seemed somehow different than it had before the crisis. The galaxy had been wounded, perhaps mortally, but it had survived. New alliances had been forged in the fires of necessity. Ancient hatreds had given way to pragmatic cooperation. The future, while uncertain, held possibilities that had not existed since the war in heaven itself. On distant Terra, in the ruins of what had once been the greatest palace in human space, a child found a fragment of golden metal that pulsed with warmth despite the nuclear winter that shrouded the world. When she touched it, she heard a voice that spoke not in words, but in feelings of protection and hope. The Emperor lived, though not in any form that mortal flesh could contain. The Silent King brooded in exile, though his wisdom might yet guide his people to something approaching redemption. The galaxy had learned that survival sometimes required the cooperation of former enemies, though whether that lesson would be remembered when the immediate crisis faded remained to be seen. In the end, the question that haunted every survivor was not whether they had won or lost, but whether the galaxy that emerged from the cosmic war would prove worthy of the price that had been paid for its preservation. The dead numbered in the trillions. Entire civilizations had been reduced to memory. Technologies that had taken millennia to develop had been expended in moments of desperate need. Yet somewhere in the ruins and the darkness, new alliances were taking root. Former enemies shared knowledge that might prevent future catastrophes. Children born in the aftermath of cosmic war would grow up in a galaxy where cooperation between species was not merely possible, but proven. The age of the imperium was ending, but the age that would replace it remained unwritten. Whether it would be remembered as the beginning of a new golden age, or merely a brief respite before the next catastrophe, would depend on choices yet to be made by beings not yet born. In the space between certainty and hope, the galaxy continued its ancient dance around the stellar furnaces that had witnessed the rise and fall of 1 billion civilizations. And perhaps, for the first time since the war in heaven itself, that dance held the promise of something greater than mere survival. The future remained unwritten, and that alone was victory enough.